Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food for Thought. Before we start today's program, I have a few quick announcements. The first is a very exciting one. We're going to return to in-person programming next month. This July, we'll have two programs that will take place in the Archives Farley Auditorium. Now, for those of you who would still like to participate virtually, we are working to ensure that we will be able to live stream these programs to our Facebook and YouTube channels, so you'll still be able to join live remotely. Now, these two programs are first, a book talk at noon on Thursday, July 8th, when Ben Beard will present on his book, The South Never Plays Itself, a film buff's journey through the South on screen. Second, I'd like to ask you to join us again next month in person or virtually as our Food for Thought lecture series continues on Thursday, July 15th at noon Central Standard Time with Jimmy Stiles' talk on indigo stinks. Today, I'm very happy to present to you Dr. Robert F. Moss, who writes about food, drink, and travel from his home in Charleston, South Carolina. He's the contributing barbecue editor for Southern Living and a frequent contributor to a range of other publications. He is the author of several books, including two that are available in our online museum store. The first of those is Barbecue, The History of an American Institution, and the second is the basis of his presentation today, Southern Spirits, 400 Years of Drinking in the American South with Recipes. So I would like to welcome Robert Moss.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for the great introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining us. As Alex said, I wrote a book called Southern Spirits, 400 Years of Drinking in the American South. And the with recipes part was added by the editor because they said that helps sell more books. And indeed, there are quite a number of recipes in there. And the talk today, comes from is drawn largely from the book, or at least the research I did when putting the book together. The topic is going to be the secret history of Southern cocktails. Originally, it was going to be in 3 glasses, but as I started preparing a little bit more, I snuck a couple extra ones in there. So we may have 4 or 5 or 6 glasses to talk about as we go through Southern cocktails. Being a virtual presentation, that feel free to, I'm always happy to answer questions or pause along the way. I know that you can submit questions via chat, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to talk through those. So let's dive right in. But before we do, I do want to give a warning. There will be some math in the presentation today, but it's very, very simple math. I think all of us can handle it. So let's talk about Southern cocktails. And when you think of a Southern cocktail, what do you think of? And I think most people probably, if they think of a Southern cocktail, this is what comes into their mind first. And certainly it was what popped into my mind first before I undertook all the research and wrote the book. And that's a nice icy mint julep. Here, the silver julep cups on a tray with mint. And of course, I think if you think about mint juleps, you think that's a bourbon drink, right? There's got to be bourbon up there under the ice. That is definitely a Southern cocktail, but not the original Southern cocktail. In fact, the bourbon mint julep didn't come onto the scene until quite a bit later. So we're going to talk today about sort of how we got to the bourbon mint julep in the 20th century, and sort of the evolution of Southern spirits and Southern drinking in the colonial era through the 19th century, straight up and we'll even touch a little bit on today. So when talking about cocktails and spirits and sort of the original recipes for cocktails in the United States, and indeed the United States was the originator of the mixed drink or the cocktail, and it's really where it was an American thing and created largely in the South as well. The South really was at the forefront of creating cocktails, but that came about as a solution to a problem. So what is that problem? Well, first, back in the colonial era, really back before the 19th century, Southerners in general and Americans in the larger sense were drinking primarily a couple of things. And it wasn't whiskey. It wasn't bourbon. In fact, the name bourbon wasn't even around. What is it used for spirits until well into the 19th century. So back during the 1800s, even before the Revolution, rum was the biggest spirit in the South and in American colonies as a whole. And these are 2 ads from the newspaper in Savannah from around 1800, so a little bit post revolution, but even straight through till 1800. Rum, a lot of imported wine. So you'll see imported sherry, Malaga, Lisbon, Tenerife. So a lot of Portuguese wine being imported, and then you see French brandy down there, and then Northwood brandy. French brandy would be brandy that would be made in France and imported. That was the prize stuff. That was the good stuff. You could get domestic brandy, often made with apples or with peaches back in the early days, because grapes, the United States really didn't have a wine industry until much later. Certainly not in the 18th century. And so that's what people were drinking. You'll see the other ad on the right as well. You see a lot of Jamaican, West India, and Northwood rum. So Jamaican and West Indian rum came from the Caribbean. Northwood rum would actually be made in New England, which had a big rum industry that developed in the 18th century. But related to the problem of why mix, why mix cocktails, right? Why do you want to mix your rum or your brandy with something else? Well, up until 1800, there had been very little innovation in the way people made distilled spirits. This is actually a picture of an alembic from a medieval manuscript, and you can see you basically have that metal vessel on the left there that's heated over a fire. Back in the old days, they were sort of embedded in sort of brick and sand and then the alcohol boils up, it goes down the tube, and is collected off on the right there in that little collection. So that's from the medieval era, when distilling first arrived in Europe, and it came from the Middle East. It was originally invented there in the Middle East and brought to Europe by traders. What you see here is the stills at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon. And those of you who've been to Mount Vernon may have had a chance to tour Washington's distillery. This was recreated 20 or so years ago, and it's a recreation of the best they can tell what Washington's distillery looked like, but it's an actual working distillery, and they actually will make whiskey at Mount Vernon. But you'll see there's not a whole lot of difference between the distilling technology in Washington's day than there was centuries before. It's still copper stills in this case. You can't really see the still because it's embedded inside this brick. Sort of this brick box, but burn fire underneath it. Put whatever your fermented base would be. So if you're making brandy, that would be fermented grape juice or wine. If you're making rum, it would be molasses that's been fermented. If you're making whiskey, which they started making whiskey really started to take off toward the end of the 18th century, and it really took off in the 19th century. Then you put fermented beer, basically, which is fermented grains, corn, rye, wheat sometimes, or a combination of them. And George Washington was distilling rye at his distillery in Virginia right around 1800. But this leads us to the cocktail. That form of distilling, those copper pot stills, could only distill the liquor so much. It could only get so much of the impurities out of it. So the early spirits were filled with congeners or congeners, depending on how you say it, which are the impurities that are left behind, in the alcohol after it goes up and down this tube. And actually, in this bucket of this barrel would be a big coiled tube of cold water, and you would draw the alcohol here off at the tap. But it's very impure, very hard to drink. Not the kind of slow sipping spirits that you would think about if you're sipping brandy today, or if you're sipping whiskey today, or even good aged rum. So, what did colonial Southerners do to make their liquor go down a little bit easier? A lot of them would make a toddy, which is also known as a sling. And if you think about toddy today, you might think of a hot toddy, sort of like this, maybe with cinnamon and a little star anise and all that. Or if you think about a sling, you might be thinking about a gin sling on the left, or maybe even a Singapore sling on the right, some fruity, very sweet and acidic type of drink. But that's not the kind of sling or toddy that they were making back in the colonial days. These are sort of the raw ingredients of a toddy, in addition to your spirit, would be sugar and a little bit of water. So you'll see on the right example, this is sort of colonial style sugar. it wouldn't have been the white granulated sugar that we're familiar with today. It's much more like if you ever have Demerara sugar or Jaggery or any of the sort of more rougher sugars, you'll see it has a lot. It's brown because it has a lot of molasses left in it. It's hard. You would carve a lump of sugar off of the big cone, put it in a glass, and then you would use a toddy stick, which is what's on the right. Put a little water in the sugar, take your toddy stick, and basically make a syrup out of the sugar by mashing it with the water, and then pour in your spirit, and you'd have a toddy. It could be a rum toddy if you put rum in it. It could be a brandy toddy if you put brandy in it. A gentleman would love to have imported French brandy, but they may have to make do with apple or peach brandy distilled right there in the U.S. Whiskey toddy, not so likely at this age. Was not a lot of whiskey being drunk yet in America. That would come really with the rise of distilling in the Appalachians and in Pennsylvania in the early part of the 19th century. So there's your math. Sugar plus spirit plus sugar plus water equals a toddy, and the sugar would cut the spirit and make it more palatable, something you could enjoy sipping a lot more than if you just had the raw spirits. So what's a toddy and what's a sling? That's a good question. David Wondrich, who's a really good cocktail historian, dug into the question of what's a toddy or sling, and his conclusion was toddy was perceived as a hot drink that you could also make cold, and a sling was a cold drink that you could also make hot. So that clears it up a whole lot. Essentially, it's the same thing. One thing to note, though, when we talk about a cold toddy or a cold sling at this time in the South, it would not be very cold. It basically be room temperature because there was no ice available in the South in the 19th century. In the wintertime, if you're up north in Virginia or a little further up, you could certainly have ice. But during the summer, there are no ice houses. There's no ice available, no artificial refrigeration until early in the 19th century. So those toddies, a cold toddy would simply be room temperature, which, depending on the time of year, could easily be in the 80s. So not a cool, refreshing drink necessarily. All right, so that's our first glass. It's a toddy. It's just a little sugar and water mixed back. Number two is the cocktail. And you might be thinking, well, are all these things cocktails? We're talking about mixed drink. And the answer is yes. Today, we use the term cocktail to refer to any number of concoctions. Back in the colonial era or early 19th century, a cocktail was a very specific type of drink. So here is the first known reference in print to the word cocktail. This appeared in a New York newspaper, Hudson, New York, called the Balancing Columbian Repository, 1806, and it defines cocktail. Cocktail, and it's two words in this case, is a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. It is vulgarly called a bittered sling. So if you think about what a sling is, this is a sling with bitters added to it. Here's another example of cocktail and toddy and the variations between them. This is from a guy named Henry H. Didymus was his pen name. Henry Durrell was his actual name, and he visited New Orleans in the early 1840s and wrote a book called New Orleans as I Found It. The people in New Orleans love their brandy cocktail, and he explained to the readers what the difference between that and a toddy is. Brandy toddy is made by adding together a little water, a little sugar, and a great deal of brandy. Mix well and drink. A brandy cocktail is comprised of the same ingredients with the addition of a shade of Stoughton's bitters. And so that's the distinguishing or the line of demarcation, as Didymus said, was the bitters. So add bitters into the equation. You add bitters to a sling or bitters to a toddy, and you get a drink known as cocktail. Now, what are those bitters? So Henry Didymus referred to Stoughton's bitters. That was actually a very popular early brand of, or not even brand, early style of bitters. It was developed by a Dr. Stoughton in England in the early 18th century. And so his name got put upon it. But it wasn't necessarily a branded product. This is back before trademarks and copyright law, really. And you'll see that it sort of became a generic term for a style of bitters. And here's a gentleman, Dr. J.D. Phillips and Company, who makes Phillips Improved Stoughton bitters. And bitters really started off, like so many things in the cocktail world, started off as a form of medicine. and usually bitters are, alcohol with a whole variety of different things, bitter substances, typically, all sorts of herbs and roots and things like that, sort of steeped in it, makes a very bitter flavor. But originally, bitters were something you drank for, like in the case of Dr. J.D. Phillips. His bitters were apparently good for just about anything that ailed you, including worms, weakness or debility, seasickness, and the sick headache. So take a good dram of bitters and to cure you up. Used to be, Stoughton Bitters was a very popular brand or popular type of bitter. You can find them in bars all over the place throughout the South and throughout the U.S. Though they faded out later on. But that's its cocktail. So you take your bitters, add it in. You take your choice of bitters, and you have a drink called cocktail. All right, now we're getting back to the julep, but this is the original julep, not quite the silver cups that you saw on at the opening. What is a cocktail? I mean, sorry, what is a mint? A mint julep? It's basically the same thing as a bittered sling, except that instead of bitters, you add mint. So you're using mint instead of bitters to give a little flavoring to the concoction. Now, the word julep itself, like bitters, that came out of the medicinal world. The word was originally gulab or julab, a Persian word for sort of a medicinal dram or a medicinal concoction. Best we can tell, the word first started being applied to a drink made, basically mint, a sling or a toddy with mint in Virginia around the time of the Revolution. There's a couple of travel logs that capture Virginians drinking juleps. I think the earliest ones were captured or maybe made with rum. So you basically would make a toddy out of rum, steep a little mint into it for flavoring, and drink it. But again, like a toddy or sling, it's going to be a warm drink at best, because there would have been no ice to ice it down. So no big cup of no big chalice of icy mint juleps. So that's what takes us up to around the time, the turn of the 19th century, around 1800. Toddies, slings, juleps, and cocktail are some of the most popular drams in the South and in America at large. But the 19th century was a time of a lot of innovation. So lots of stuff was happening around this time. And it really changed the way people drank and what they drank and how they drank it. So let's talk through a few of those. So we looked at stills earlier. On the left here, this is Alexander Anderson's patent condensing tub, one of the early patents in distilling technology. You'll see what his innovation was to take that, basically make this condenser tub up here that sort of sits between the still, which is that old pot still, and the worm where they cooled it. And it would actually pass the heated distillate through this chamber, which would also be filled with more mash, and would actually heat the mash as it gets fed in. So it's a much more efficient way to basically make use of all the heat so you don't lose it coming out of the still. Just one of very many innovations that developed over the 19th century. So go from this one, which I believe was 1801, was Alexander Anderson, to H. Heinz's patent still in 1893. This is a column still, so a very tall still. And there are lots of other innovations like this around the same time of stills that would let you distill liquor to a much higher proof and get rid of a lot of the impurities that characterize old pot still liquor. In particular, with column stills, distillers could crank it up and actually produce alcohol that was almost pure, 190 proof, 95% alcohol, which is what typically we call grain alcohol. If you think of Everclear today, that's grain alcohol. That's about or even some vodkas, or it's about as pure as you can get alcohol to be. That was not possible in 1801, but it was possible by the end of the 19th century as distilling technology improved. And there's another innovation, which is these are charred barrels. So those of you who are familiar with bourbon or rye whiskey will know that to be categorized a straight bourbon or a straight rye whiskey, you have to age the whiskey for 2 years or more in a new charred oak barrel. Bourbon makers can't reuse them, so other types of spirits folks will. That actually there's a lot of fishy stories about how barrel aging came to be, including one literally old myth that the guy who sort of accidentally invented barrel aging because he was trying to get the stink. He was using an old barrel that had held fish, and so he was trying to get the smell of fish out of a barrel. So he burned it and to get the taste out, and discovered it made whiskey better after he shipped the whiskey in it. Not at all true. Basically, that's charcoal is what you're creating, and people knew about charcoal filtering, and people were storing water often in charred casks to just sort of purify it. So it basically acting like a charcoal filter as the water gets pulled into the wood and then pushed back out. Turns out the same thing really helps whiskey as well. So as you put whiskey in there, the char, it picks up a lot of the charred flavor, the sugars, the things from that char, and it purifies the spirit as it pulls in and out. So that was a big differentiator that didn't really happen up until, it started barrel aging before the Civil War, but it was really after the Civil War that barrel aged whiskey took off, and it really made whiskey drinkable for the first time. It became a spirit that people liked. But whiskey wasn't the only thing to be barrel aged. You could barrel age anything. You can barrel age rum. You can barrel age brandy. So you had better and better aged spirits coming along as you went through the 19th century. So that brings us back to a different type of julep, and call it the hailstorm julep, which is really what led us toward the cocktails that we have today. So this is an example of the ice trade, which really developed in the early 19th century. A guy named Frederick Tudor was one of several sort of entrepreneurs. He was from Boston. And what they figured out they could do is they could take ice that was cut from lakes up in New England and elsewhere in the winter. Like you'll see these big blocks they're cutting here with these sort of sleds with these giant blades that they pulled across them. And then they would load them on ships, pack them in sawdust and a variety of other things, trying to insulate it. And they took it down south. In fact, one of the first ice houses, commercial ice houses, was here in Charleston, where I live. And that was back in the late 1790s. The early ice houses didn't really work. The ice tended to melt, so your profits would literally melt away. But as they improved insulation within the ice houses, by the 1810s or so, 1820s, they started to be more practical, and Frederick Tudor and others soon established ice houses. And so by 1820, 1830, most every city in the South, every port city in the South had an ice house that was kept supplied by these ships coming down from the north, and it would guarantee you a supply of ice till well into the summer, oftentimes all the way through the summer as the insulation got better. And literally they'd have these giant blocks of ice just sort of sitting, melting away, but they'd have enough to chip off and sell to people. One of the ice is used for a lot of different things, like making ice cream and pastry was one of the earliest uses of it. But making cocktails and cooling drinks was one of the first things, which you can imagine if you're in the South, there's no air conditioning, a refreshing glass of ice. You don't have enough ice to maybe have an entire refrigerator at home yet, but you could cool off a beverage and have a refreshing beverage. So that's where the hailstorm julep came from, which is a variation of the mint julep. First reference I've found to it is a lawyer named John Latrobe in 1832. He was a lawyer from Baltimore, but he went to visit the White Sulphur Springs, which is now the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. At the time it was in Virginia. It was called White Sulphur Springs. And these spring resorts developed when people would go take the waters, as they called it, which would be soak in the mineral spring baths. Originally it was for invalids or people who are, the mineral baths were supposed to be curative and help people recover from whatever ailments were plaguing them. But increasingly people found that, this is a lot of fun to go hang out in the cool mountains in the summertime. And so there were summer resorts that whole families would go to, wealthy families, during the 1840s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that's where John Latrobe first came across. He said, I saw here for the first time a hailstorm. That is to say, a mint julep made with a hailstorm around it. The drink is manufactured pretty much as usual and well filled with a quantity of ice chopped in small pieces, which is then put in the shape of a fillet or fillet around the outside of the tumbler, where it adheres like a ring of rock candy and turns and forms an external icy application to your lower lip as you drink it. So I can only imagine to somebody who's, it's in the middle of July and you finally got away to the cool mountains and the bartender made you a icy julep and you put it against your lips. You can see how that it would be heavenly. In fact, people would just rave about juleps in the 1830s and 1840s. People wrote poems in honor of the julep. There was like this remarkable thing. And this is one of the great julep makers. This is a man named John Dabney, who actually have another book coming out next year, in February of next year, called The Lost Southern Chefs. It's all about the rise of commercial dining in the 19th century South. And John Dabney plays a very big role in that. He's from Virginia, was from Virginia. He was actually born into slavery and was an enslaved man. And as was surprisingly common in the 1840s and 1850s, he was working under this a system that was called self-hire, which really got bigger and bigger in Virginia, in which a enslaved person could basically, with permission of their owner, hire themselves out to somebody else and do work for them. And he actually was, though while still a slave, hired out to initially as a waiter in a hotel restaurant, and then rose up the ranks to become a bartender, and then opened a restaurants of his own, even while he was still enslaved. It's quite a remarkable story. And again, I've written all about it in my new book, which will come out next year. But I'll just focus on Dabney's juleps. So John Dabney was very famous. He and another enslaved man named Jim Cook were Richmond's two famed julep makers. So I have a quote about Dabney julep. The julep a la Dabney is a worldwide art upon personages whom he holds in high esteem. They are prepared in a silver goblet 14 inches high and imbibed through solid silver straws. And the way Dabney would make a julep would be truly this gigantic goblet. It was a multi-person drink, and he would mix it all up, put it, and he actually shaved the ice with basically like a grater over a big wooden box. So it'd be finely shaved ice. So he would mix it all up, get all the compound in there, which would be some form of sugar, his spirits, probably peach brandy. In most, because most Virginians were making their juleps with peach brandy back then, with some, and then whatever else he wanted to put in there, his sweetener, and of course lots of mint. But then Dabney would fill it with ice to like have a huge like sort of crown of dome of ice on top of it, and would make decorations out of ice and stick it to the outside, and then he would cover the top with all sorts of things. We think of like juleps of having just like a big sprig of green mint. Not a Dabney julep. He would actually top it with like fruit and flowers. You have grapes, sliced peaches, bananas, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, raisins, roses, carnations, and violets, all on top of a single julep that was described in a newspaper. So it'd be this really massive, decorative drink that you would have multiple straws. So John Dabney worked in the summer times. He went west with the wealthy white Virginians to the springs. This is Old Sweet Springs, which is now in Monroe County, West Virginia. And Dabney worked there both before and then later after the Civil War. After he was a free man, he continued to be a bartender and to be a famous bartender at the resort springs. During the rest of the year, when everyone went back east from the springs, John Dabney worked in various different establishments, but he sort of became famous working at the Ballard House and Exchange Hotel. So on the right there is the Ballard House, built by a man named John Ballard in the 1850s, and then Ballard's house really took off. It became the most respected hotel in Richmond, and he built the Exchange Hotel on the left, which you see there. He connected them with that overhead bridge so you could walk from one to the other. And John Dabney and Jim Cook both worked at the Ballard House right up till the time of the Civil War, tending the bar there. And in fact, it was there in 1860 that this young gentleman got his taste of a mint julep. This is Bertie, the Prince of Wales, so Queen Victoria's son, the future King Edward VII. In 1860, he made an American tour, the first Prince of Wales to come tour America. He was only 19 years old at the time, and apparently quite a hellion. And Queen Victoria was supposedly glad to get rid of him for a year while he went and traveled in the U.S. But the Prince of Wales and his entourage, which he had all these minor noblemen who were traveling with him, they stayed at the Ballard House and Exchange Hotel and had private rooms. And at some point, either John Dabney or Jim Cook or both of them, David Wondrich and I both have hypothesized that maybe both of them came and served the Prince of Wales, because there are various accounts that say it was John Dabney. There are various ones that say it was Jim Cook, and probably the two bartenders would both go attend to him. But they made a gigantic julep in a big chalice with all the fruit and everything. Apparently the Prince of Wales and his entourage each got straws and took a sip and loved it so much that they had him come back the next morning before they were leaving Richmond and have him create another one to get their morning off to a start. All right, so that takes us up to glass number 4, a Hailstorm Julep. So now we're up to 5 and 6, and I sort of stuck them together because the Sazerac and the Old Fashioned, because they're definitely related, and they are related to the cocktail. So if you recall, cocktail is sugar, spirit, water, and add bitters. So in New Orleans, a particular type of cocktail became very popular. On the left here is a bottle of Sazerac de Fort et Fiel cognac, which is a very prized form of brandy, the most prized by connoisseurs. That's brandy that comes from the Cognac region of France. And so you'll see on the right, the Sazerac, I'm not even sure where the name comes from, but Sazerac de Fort et Fiel was very popular brand of brandy, straight up until the Civil War and a little bit thereafter. Now, it's not a cocktail without bitters, and New Orleans, like a lot of cities, New Orleans had its own its pharmacists and doctors who were making their own bitters. One of them was a man named A.A. Peychaud, who was a pharmacist, or druggist, I guess you would call it, at 90 Royal Street. And he came up with a recipe for bitters that became very popular in New Orleans. In fact, you'll see the label on the right there. If you buy a bottle of Peychaud's bitters today, which are still sold, they're bright red in color, and they still have a label very similar to the one on the right. So in New Orleans, you would have a cognac cocktail, or a Sazerac cocktail, if you wanted to call your spirit by name. So you would ask for a cocktail made with Sazerac cognac, and entirely likely, being in New Orleans, they would have used Peychaud's bitters with it, hence the Sazerac. So the Sazerac cocktail originally was made with cognac, not with whiskey. If you're familiar with Sazeracs today, you'll know that they're typically made with rye whiskey. So what happened? How did that shift occur? Well, what happened was this little bug on the left here, which is a form of aphid known as phylloxera, I think is how you would say it, phylloxera. And it struck the French wine regions, particularly cognac, really hard in the 1870s. And essentially, it's this little aphid that just wiped out the grape harvest and just about destroyed the French wine industry, and in particular cognac. And since cognac brandy was made from wine in the cognac region, now you no longer have cognac brandy because there's no wine to put in the stills. You actually had a lot of old cognac because they would age it, but over time it became rarer and rarer and rarer. And then what happened was a lot of other sort of unscrupulous operators started trying to pass off other types of spirits as cognac brandy, and it really lost its reputation in the market. People wouldn't buy it anymore because it was very expensive, or they didn't trust what they were getting was genuine. You get home and taste it, and it would be nothing like cognac. So what happened instead was risky distilling's getting better and better and better. The barrel aging's coming along, that whiskey's coming along quite nicely. And so rye whiskey got substituted for the brandy or the cognac in all these drinks, including in the, I had to run this. This is from Punch magazine, 1890, showing the phylloxera drinking up essentially the entire output of the cognac region. But the Sazerac cocktail shifted to being made with rye whiskey. And so today it's a rye whiskey cocktail. I'm not sure when, but somewhere along the line, bartenders started rinsing the glass that they made the cocktail in with initially absinthe, and then later, after absinthe was outlawed, with Herb Saint, which is a New Orleans-based absinthe substitute, but it has that same sort of licorice type flavor. And so they rinsed the glass with that, and that's become the sort of signature of a Sazerac. There was a Sazerac bar in New Orleans. These are gentlemen in the white coats here would happily stir you up or shake you up a Sazerac cocktail for 20 cents. And then the Sazerac bar moved at some point to the Roosevelt Hotel, the new hotel. That hotel is still actually there in New Orleans. It's now it got totally remodeled. It was almost destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, rebuilt, and now there is a new Sazerac bar there. It's actually a little bit different location than the old Sazerac bar used to be, but you can still go there, and I have. It's quite delicious, and get a Sazerac cocktail, which is what you see here. It has that bright red color. Comes from the whiskey with rye whiskey with Peychaud bitters. Some people actually these days will mix, do a blend of rye and cognac to make a Sazerac. But that's how we got from a cognac or a Sazerac cocktail, literally a cocktail drink, to the drink we have today. All right. So you'll see on the right here, this is the first, or actually this is the revised edition of Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide. Jerry Thomas wrote the first known Bartender's Guide in 1862. He was sort of the king of New York bartenders, though he actually worked here in Charleston at the Mills House briefly, and also in New Orleans. So he made a sort of a Southern tour, and I think probably picked up a lot of Southern recipes while he was down here. They took him back to New York and became, very, very famous up there, published this bar manual. You'll see that, by this point, this is the revised edition was, I think, 1872. People aren't just drinking toddies anymore. They still have toddies and slings, but they also have eggnog, julep, smash, cobblers, cocktails, sangarees, a whole flip, sours, a whole array, enough different kind of mixed drinks that you could make a bartender's manual out of them. Somewhere along the way, the term cocktail stopped being that particular recipe of a bittered sling, and it just became a more generic term for a mixed drink. So if you went into a bar in the 1880s, 1890s, and you wanted a cocktail made the original way, you would ask for an old-fashioned. Give me an old-fashioned cocktail. And over time, the old-fashioned became a thing of its own, which is really usually now made with some sort of whiskey, either bourbon or rye, though you can still make them with other things. Unless you're in Wisconsin, they make the brandy old-fashions up there, and they do it a little differently than the old-fashioned, which is they muddle in a bunch of cherries and fruit, and usually add a spritz of something on top, like 7-Up or something sweet. It's a very sweet drink, quite different than the old-fashioned, as I now call it. But the old-fashioned is the original cocktail from the Southern bar. So we've talked a lot about rye whiskey, and one of the things I was trying to get across in the Southern Spirits book was that bourbon is actually relatively a late comer as a spirit in the South. In fact, up until really after Prohibition, you really only found bourbon whiskey in Kentucky and then along the Mississippi, because that's where it was primarily sold. What you would get here, like in South Carolina, where I am, or even down in Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, the whiskey there was almost certainly going to be one of two things: either rye whiskey, and it probably came from Pennsylvania or Maryland, or it might be corn liquor, which would be unaged white, just or white whiskey, not fine aged bourbon. That actually didn't come along till later. Rye whiskey was what everybody substituted in for the cognac once that was no longer available to connoisseurs. So, but what happened to rye? Like, if just even a few years ago, it was 10 years or so ago, it was very hard to find rye whiskey on American shelves. It all but disappeared. Well, here's one of the things that happened. Prohibition that happened. This is, went into effect in 1920, and a lot of the rye whiskey literally got poured down the drain, as these fine law enforcement gentlemen are doing in 1920. the typical line has been that rye whiskey and bourbon, all the American distilleries shut down. And then after Prohibition, Americans' tastes had changed. They wanted lighter things. And then rye whiskey just never came back from Prohibition, which isn't exactly the case. I always thought it was a little bit puzzling when right after Prohibition, when all the distilleries are firing back up again, a lot of the distilleries have been bought and sold during Prohibition. All the brands got shuffled around. And by the time you come out of Prohibition, you'll see a lot of the whiskey companies coming out with, like, you'll see lots of like Mount Vernon rye whiskey, Famous Melrose rye whiskey. It's advertised very widely, sold very widely in the mid 1930s, all the way up till 1940. I think what really happened to rye was World War II, and it's still not exactly clear why, but what happened is clear. So you'll see the sale figures for whiskey in over the years. So here we are in 1939, 1940. You'll see that bourbon and rye, bourbon was more popular by far at this point, but rye was still pretty respectable. And you'll see from the straight whiskeys, and that's whiskey that's been aged at least 2 years in those charred barrels. You'll see that straight whiskey had a large share of the market, and blended whiskey, which was whiskey made from those column stills, they would take the almost pure grain alcohol and blend it with a little bit of aged spirits to flavor it. That really was was starting to take off, but still people drank more straight whiskey coming out of Prohibition, going into World War II. But you'll see these numbers really plunge of straight whiskey right here during the war. And the reason for that is all the distilleries had to shut down, and they were converted to making military grade alcohol for the war effort. And the blends took over because they could still make blended whiskeys. You'll see by 1946, as you exited the war, the blends had 90% of the market. But bourbon came back. And by 1953, it was not quite where it was before the war, but a lot of people were drinking bourbon. Rye never came back for some reason. It's just a fraction of the market, and it remained that way straight until the 21st century. And it was really only after the craft cocktail revival that rye whiskey came back. And so we've made it all back around to the juleps again. So what you see really after Prohibition is when juleps became a bourbon drink. Up until Prohibition, you can make a julep with just about anything. Brandy was very popular. So was rye whiskey. You could even find rum juleps, and bourbon, of course, was a popular one as well with Kentucky whiskey. But as we saw with rye disappearing after World War II, rye juleps just totally faded away. The Kentucky Derby actually had a lot to do, I think, with establishing or codifying the julep as a Kentucky beverage and a bourbon drink. The first Kentucky Derby was way back in 1875, but there's no real evidence that early on they were serving juleps. You could find a few there, but it really was after Prohibition in 1938 the Kentucky Derby or Churchill Downs named the mint julep its official drink. And the next year they started introducing these souvenir glasses that were a big hit. And so everybody started drinking, Kentucky bourbon juleps at the Kentucky Derby at a time that rye was just about to disappear altogether. And so we're left with the modern julep, which is a whiskey drink made with bourbon whiskey usually in a silver julep cup with lots of crushed ice and mint. You'll notice all the fruit and the decorations disappeared from the 19th century version, but that's still a fine drink today. So that in 3, 4, 5, or 6 classes is a tour of Southern Spirits history. And again, if you want to find out more, you can go to my website's robertfmoss.com and follow me on social media. And I think, Alex, we can take questions if we have any.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was very fascinating. I didn't even know some things like the term cocktail, that it was actually a drink. And now I feel like I have a lot of fun facts now that I can be able to roll out. So to start off, and of course, our audience, please feel free to submit questions. If you put them in the comments, we'll be able to see them and I can share them with Dr. Moss. But I also have a few questions of my own. The first is kind of more of a fun question. Maybe not easy, but fun. So, we've been talking about spirits. Your other book is that we have here at the archives is about barbecue. In your professional opinion, what is the best Southern spirit to pair with some barbecue?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, traditionally, you don't really pair spirits with barbecue, right?
Yeah.
It's traditionally that you drink the spirits while you're cooking the barbecue all night, and then either you have, depending on where you are, beer is very common with barbecue. Here in South Carolina, at least until recently, it was almost always sweet tea. It was what you would have at the barbecue joints, most of which didn't even have alcohol licenses. That's changed a lot in recent years, and you're now starting to see barbecue joints with entire cocktail sort of cocktail programs. I think whiskey of any sort goes well with barbecue. I just because of the historical association, I really like rye whiskey, as I talked about it. So I'd probably have a little flask of rye in my pocket when we're out cooking a hog all night. So that's what I would pick.
That's what you would pick, kind of as the good historical connection in your mind. I love that. So you were mentioning, the Prohibition, and you showed the picture and of them pouring out, and talked about this huge shift in the mint julep and rye whiskey that comes after Prohibition. But I'm also interested in the time of Prohibition. What was, because I know, of course, legally, people weren't supposed to be having cocktails or having drinks, but what maybe was the cocktail of that time? Was there anything kind of shifts happening during the time of Prohibition?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing to note with Prohibition came about as an anti-saloon movement, largely, and the saloons, which I write about a lot in the book, were seen as, well, they were very male places, and it's where men would get together and drink often after work. And the classic temperance message was all about the saloons being, we want to shut down the saloons because men are going there and squandering their entire paycheck and getting drunk and being beating up their kids and just being terrible. It was supposed to end all the ills of society. But up until then, drinking spirits was very much an all male activity. The saloon was a male bastion. So one thing that happened during Prohibition was, it became, drinking spirits became in vogue with both men and women, and you had lots of parties. I mean, I think the Great Gatsby and the Flapper, you get that image of the, people drinking gin and martinis and all that type of thing. And certainly that took off. There was actually, rum grew in popularity during Prohibition, in part because a lot of wealthy Americans would fly to Cuba or take a boat to Cuba, where they were, and you could get away from Prohibition. That's when the Cuban, sort of nightlife really flourished, all the nightclubs and everything. Lots of rum was drunk in Cuba, and that's actually when Bacardi became very popular. Bacardi introduced using a column still. We talked about the difference in the stills. Old rum made in the pot still is that really dark, like we used to call it hogo, H-O-G-O, which is a corruption of a French term, but it's that sort of high or almost like rotted meat taste that the old rum would have. Bacardi introduced column stills and really purified the rum and made it a much lighter. They can even have a silver rum, which is unaged, or than a slightly aged one. So rum drinks became very big during Prohibition, and I think that's something else that shifted. And also people drank a lot of bad whiskey, rock gut whiskey, and things that was imported or made by bootleggers of very questionable quality. So the whole drinking culture, the industry, everything was just basically spun around and disrupted by the decade or plus of Prohibition. So everything was very, very different in terms of what people were drinking and how they drank it, in 1933 than they had in 1919.
I'd never even thought about that there's almost like a generation growing up who then all of a sudden it's available, and maybe your tastes have changed and maybe things have changed, and
absolutely. In fact, this is a book. Hopefully, I'm hold it. You guys can see it. This is Irwin Cobb's own recipe book. This is actually a book that was published in, I think, 1936, and it's by the Frankfurt Distilleries in Kentucky. And you see a lot of these things. The distilleries had to basically do recipe books to like teach people how to make cocktails again, because they didn't have their, you like say you have a whole generation that came of age at a time when you were drinking bathtub gin, but no one remembered how to make all the old cocktails. And so in here are all the recipes for a lot of the 19th century cocktails, like the Jerry Thomas book that we saw. So you basically, the American whiskey industry was starting from scratch and having to re-educate an entire set of consumers who didn't know much about aged whiskey or even the old way of making cocktails.
Oh, wow. Oh, it looks like we have a couple questions from the audience. Laura Newland Hill, were these drinks popular outside of saloons and bars, regularly served at home social gatherings? So is there, some chance that women maybe were having them at home?
Certainly a chance of that. So it's not like no women drank before Prohibition. It just, the cocktail, I'm trying to think when the cocktail party became a thing. I believe that was a Prohibition era thing of people having, you couldn't go out to the bar, right? Because it was, or if you did, it was a speakeasy. It was a legal activity. So like thinking of Sinclair Lewis's novel Babbitt, that makes a big deal of cocktail parties being very trendy. Certainly people would drink it in the home. I think it was very common for, throughout the 19th century for gentlemen to have a little bar, and you'd mix your toddy and all, each person would mix the toddy to their own liking. So that was there was definitely home cocktail drinking in the 19th century. But the great bartenders and all that was really started to rise in the 1830s, 1840s, and the saloon became the center of drinking culture, certainly up until Prohibition.
We have another one here from Scotty Kirkland. Gore Vidal quipped in one of his memoirs about having a Sazerac at the Roosevelt that included a raw egg yolk as an ingredient. What's the weirdest thing you've ever included in a cocktail?
That I've ever included? I don't know if I put it in or somebody else put it in. Let me think. I've certainly had drinks with egg. I'm not sure if it was yolks, but definitely lots of drinks with egg whites. That's a very common way you shake. It thickens the drink. So sours, properly made, a lot of sours will have egg white shaken in it. So I don't think of that as being too weird, but others might who aren't as familiar with it. That's a good question. I'm not sure what else. There's a mezcal called Pechuga that is one of the weirder things I've had. It's actually made. It's not, well, it's distilled. So mezcal is distilled from the magua cactus, and they actually will hang a breast of chicken above the distillate, and as it's distilling, and the alcohol will go over the chicken. And I don't know if it doesn't really taste like chicken, but it's supposed to give it some kind of unique flavor. So I'd say chicken is one of the weirdest things I've had in the cocktail.
Oh, that is so very interesting. So part of the actual distilling process.
Yeah, for some reason, and the way they do mezcal in the sort of artisanal way, it's not a closed still. They're actually boiling the fermented cactus is sort of capturing above it, so you can actually hang things, in the still as it's cooking, or as the fumes are coming up and being captured in the condenser at the top.
Well, see, because that's the thing is the whole kind of other part where you were talking about, like, not just the cocktails that are made, but also the distilling process and how that changed over time, and just all the innovation and the experiments with, how they are able to kind of perfect the process. I kind of noticed that you were talking about these different places, and it's very local almost, but then there are kind of these bigger kind of companies coming up. The first ones obviously that come to my mind are places like Jack Daniels and the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, stuff like that. Are there any kind of major places that were in Alabama that were doing kind of distilling during kind of the 19th century, or the 20th century? Do you know?
I'm not talking Alabama specifically. I don't think there was a center of distilling in Alabama per se. There was then lots of spirits distilled in Alabama, because up until, up until the Civil War, distilling was largely a home enterprise. It was what people did on the farm, and so whether and the reason that you would find peach orchards throughout the South, but the vast majority of those peaches were not getting eaten or put in pies or anything like that. They were going into the stills. So it was a very common for farmers to have orchards that they would distill their own, either apples if you're in apple growing region, or peaches, which grew well throughout the South. And then increasingly a lot of corn and rye being put into the still. So you certainly would have found lots of distilling going on in Alabama on the farms out in there. But what really happened, the whiskey industry arose in a couple of major areas. People have forgotten about it, but Cincinnati, Ohio, and the areas on either side of Cincinnati, Aurora, Indiana, was a big distilling hub. There's major. That's where the largest distilleries first developed. Later developed in around various places in Pennsylvania, but in the Kentucky distilling industry really took off after the Civil War, and increasingly that became that would be shipped all over the place. So by the mid to late, well, actually by the end of the 19th century, I think the great majority of what's being drunk in Alabama probably would have been distilled in Baltimore or in Pennsylvania or in Kentucky, and then delivered via boat or train to the state.
No, and that's the thing is, it's like just finding out how everything just keeps kind of moving from this local to the bigger ones is just very fascinating. But it's also, because you're saying, the innovation that's happening in the distilling process and the size the stills can be and all of that. We have time for one more question, and we have another one here, and this should be a fun one. What is your favorite Southern comfort cocktail? So if you're going, it's Friday night, it's time to relax. What are you going for?
Well, I don't think I've had a bottle of Southern Comfort in quite a while. It's sort of a whiskey liqueur. It's sort of sweetened. So I wouldn't know if I have a favorite Southern Comfort made with that particular spirit. But my go-to, sort of cocktail at home is either an old fashioned or a Manhattan. I like those two. And I like to make old fashions with, and anybody I'd recommend making with Demerara sugar. Which are, any of the other darker sugars that you can get. You can find Demerara sugar cubes. So I think an old fashioned is great if you get 2 or 3 Demerara sugar cubes. You can make simple syrup if you like. It's the easier way to do it, which is you boil half equal parts of water and sugar into a, until it dissolves into a syrup. But I like to actually make an old fashioned with a couple of those sugar cubes, a couple bar spoons of water. You crush it with a muddler. And make the old-fashioned way. And what I like about that is you get little bits of grit from the sugar, a little bit of the sugar texture still left, as opposed to a smooth syrup. And then just a couple dashes of bitter, and then 2 ounces or so of whiskey, and that's more of my comfort cocktail, if you will.
Your comfort cocktail. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating talk. And I just want to remind everybody that we do have copies of his book, both Southern Spirits and the American Barbecue book, available in the store. And I hope that we will be able to see a lot of you in person, if not virtually, next month. Reminder that our Food for Thought will be on July 15th. Thank you all so much for coming.